In 1925, Ford opened a factory in Yokohama, Japan. General Motors followed in Osaka. By the 1930s, these two American giants were outproducing every Japanese automaker combined by 40 to 1. Japan was not competing with Detroit. Japan was watching. But the ideas that would make Japanese cars the most reliable on Earth did not come from Tokyo. They came from a statistician in Iowa and a wartime training program America abandoned. So how did a country that could not afford 2 headlights on a truck end up beating the nation that invented the automobile? It was the 1930s, and Japanese automakers were still in their infancy. The first mass-produced car in Japan, the 1917 Mitsubishi Model A, had been based on an Italian Fiat design. Nissan's early models borrowed from the British Austin 7 and the American Graham Page. Toyota's very first passenger car, the AA, was modeled after the Chrysler Airflow. Even smaller companies like Oda were building cars that resembled Ford designs, while Toyota and Sumida produced vehicles that looked strikingly similar to General Motors products. These weren't subtle influences on the Japanese auto industry. Japanese engineers were importing American and European cars, pulling them apart in workshops across Tokyo and Nagoya, and rebuilding their own versions from what they learned. Then came the Automobile Manufacturing Industries Act of 1936. On the surface, it was meant to encourage domestic production, but its real purpose was military. Japan needed trucks and transport vehicles it could produce without depending on foreign companies. Ford, GM, and Chrysler were gradually squeezed out, and by 1939, all three had shut down their Japanese operations. The war years pushed Japanese automakers fully into military production. Toyota, Nissan, and Isuzu built trucks for the Imperial Japanese Army. Resources were so scarce that some Toyota trucks rolled off the line with a single headlight and brakes only on the front axle. The engineering was crude, born from desperation rather than ambition. And then the Allied bombs fell on Japan. By 1945, Japan's industrial infrastructure was in ruins. Factories had been leveled by Allied bombing raids. 2 entire cities had been erased by atomic weapons. The country that had once watched Ford and GM operate freely within its borders now struggled to produce anything at all. However, the rebuilding of Japan's shattered factory floors brought something unexpected. The American occupation under General MacArthur permitted limited passenger car manufacturing in 1947, restricting engines to under 1,500 cubic centimeters and capping production at 300 units per year. But the real education for Japanese engineers came from a different source. The United States Army contracted Japanese automakers to repair damaged American military vehicles. Toyota, Nissan, and others suddenly had direct hands-on access to American engineering, American repair methods, and American standards of mechanical precision. Then the Korean War broke out in 1950, and everything accelerated. The Pentagon needed trucks, and Japan was the closest manufacturing base to the Korean Peninsula. Toyota alone received orders for 1,500 trucks per month. The money kept Japanese automakers alive, but the engineering knowledge they absorbed in the process was worth far more than any truck contract. And it was in that same year, 1950, that a quiet, bespectacled statistician from Wyoming arrived in Tokyo and changed the trajectory of Japanese manufacturing forever. His name was W. Edwards Deming. He was born in 1900 in Sioux City, Iowa, trained as an electrical engineer and mathematician, and had spent years developing theories about statistical quality control. His core idea about factory quality control was elegant and, at the time, radical. Instead of inspecting finished products for defects and then scrapping or repairing the failures, you should design the manufacturing process itself to prevent defects from occurring in the first place. Deming had tried to sell this idea to American manufacturers throughout the 1940s. Detroit was not interested. The Big Three were selling every car they could build. Why would they slow down a profitable assembly line to worry about the occasional lemon? American executives thought Deming's theories were too idealistic, too focused on giving decision-making power to workers on the factory floor. So Deming went to Japan, where a country rebuilding from ashes had no room for waste, no tolerance for inefficiency, and every reason to listen. And what happened next in those Tokyo lecture halls would haunt Detroit for the next 40 years. The Union of Japanese Scientists and Engineers invited him to lecture. He spoke to rooms full of executives from companies that would become household names: Toyota, Nissan, Sony, and Mitsubishi. He taught them statistical process control, continuous improvement, and the idea that quality was not an inspection checkpoint at the end of a line, but a philosophy that had to run through every single step of production. Japan did not just hear him. Japan built a whole industrial culture around his ideas. Toyota, in particular, became obsessed with what Deming taught. The company adopted total quality control in the early 1960s and won the prestigious Deming Prize in 1965. Shoichiro Toyota, who would later become chairman of Toyota, said something years later that captured the depth of this influence. He said there was not a day he did not think about what Deming meant to the company. He called Deming the core of Toyota's management. But Deming was only one thread in the fabric. Toyota's production revolution also drew from another American source, one abandoned and forgotten after the war. During World War II, the United States created a program called Training Within Industry, abbreviated TWI. With millions of men overseas, American factories needed to rapidly train inexperienced workers, many of them women, to build planes, tanks, and ammunition at wartime speed. TWA developed structured methods for on-the-job instruction, process improvement, and worker relations. The program was enormously successful. American wartime production soared because of it. But when the war ended, so did TWI. The men came home, the factories went back to business as usual, and the training manuals gathered dust on government shelves. Japan picked them up. When American occupation forces helped rebuild Japanese industry, they exported the TWI methods, and Toyota did not merely adopt them. Toyota refined them, embedded them, and never let them go. There is still a copy of the original Training Within Industry manual in the Toyota Company Museum today. From these American roots, Taiichi Ono and Shigeo Shingo built the Toyota production system. Ono developed just-in-time manufacturing, where parts arrived exactly when needed rather than sitting in expensive warehouses. He created the Andon cord, which allowed any worker on the line to stop production the moment they spotted a defect. He identified 7 categories of waste on the factory floor and systematically eliminated each one. Even Toyota's inventory system had an American inspiration. Ono studied how American supermarkets restocked their shelves, replenishing products only as customers purchased them, and applied the same logic to auto parts supply chains. The result was a factory system that needed half the workers, half the floor space, and half the time to build a car compared to a typical American plant. The cars that came off the line had fewer defects. So, what did Detroit make of all this? How did the largest car industry on Earth respond to a competitor building better products with half the resources? For 2 decades, Detroit's answer was simple: they did not notice. Japanese cars in the 1950s and 60s were seen as cheap, tinny, underpowered oddities. When Toyota first shipped cars to the United States in the late 1950s, American buyers dismissed them as small boxes that would never survive a Minnesota winter. Then the Arab oil embargo of October 1973 hit. The Arab oil embargo hit the United States like a sledgehammer. Gasoline prices quadrupled almost overnight. Fuel went from about 25 cents a gallon to over $1 in a matter of months. The American Automobile Association reported that 1 in 5 gas stations across the country ran completely dry during the worst weeks of the crisis. Drivers waited 2 and 3 hours in line to fill their tanks, and suddenly, that enormous chrome-covered V8-powered American sedan sitting in the driveway looked less like freedom and more like a liability. American consumers started walking into dealerships and asking for something they had never asked for before: fuel efficiency. The Honda Civic, the Toyota Corolla, the Datsun. Cars that had been invisible in the American market were suddenly the only things people wanted to buy. Japanese market share in the United States surged from roughly 9% in 1976 to 21% by 1980. By the end of the decade, imports had captured 28% of the American car market. What made the shift permanent was not fuel economy alone. It was what happened when American buyers actually lived with these Japanese cars. They discovered something Detroit had been ignoring for years. These cars didn't break down. If you're finding this useful, take a second to subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, where the real history behind the cars we drive is more surprising than the marketing ever lets on. Meanwhile, Detroit was handing customers the Ford Pinto, a car whose fuel tank placement led to fires so catastrophic that 27 deaths were eventually connected to the design. And the Chevrolet Vega prompted General Motors to recall roughly 130,000 units over fire hazards of its own. The 1970s earned a reputation in the United States as the decade of poorly constructed American cars, and the contrast with Japanese quality only sharpened with each passing year. When the decade turned, Japanese automobile production surpassed that of the United States for the first time. A nation that had been producing trucks with one headlight 35 years earlier was now building more cars than the one that invented the modern automobile. American manufacturers scrambled. They lobbied the government for protection. And in 1981, Japan agreed to voluntary export restraints, capping shipments at 1.68 million vehicles per year. But the quotas did not stop the flood of Japanese cars into American showrooms. They simply encouraged Japanese automakers to build higher-end, higher-margin vehicles and to open factories on American soil. Honda broke ground in Marysville, Ohio in 1979. Toyota followed with a joint venture with General Motors at the NUMMI plant in Fremont, California in 1984. And then came the moment that proved Japan had not merely caught up with America, but had lapped it. In 1983, Eiji Toyoda, the chairman of Toyota, decided the company needed a flagship luxury sedan, not a dressed-up Camry, a car that could walk into a showroom next to a Mercedes S-Class and a BMW 7 Series and make both of them look overpriced. He called it Project F1, Flagship 1, and he gave it no budget limit and no deadline. What followed was 6 years of engineering obsession. Toyota assigned 1,400 engineers and 2,300 technicians to the project, organized into 24 separate teams. The team built 450 prototypes, tested 900 different engine configurations, and accumulated 1.7 million miles of road testing. Early in the process, a group of Toyota engineers purchased Mercedes-Benzes and BMWs, drove them to a resort town outside Tokyo, and took them apart piece by piece. They studied every bolt, every seal, every panel gap. Then they aimed to beat every measurement. But here is the detail that makes this story different from every other copycat narrative. Toyota did not set out to match the Germans. They intended to embarrass them at half the price. The finished car debuted at the 1989 Detroit Auto Show under a brand name no one had ever heard before, Lexus, the LS400. It was priced at $35,000, roughly half what a comparable Mercedes S-Class cost, and well below the BMW 7 Series at $49,000. Yet the Lexus matched or exceeded both in cabin quietness, ride quality, and build precision. At 60 miles per hour, its cabin registered just 58 decibels, quieter than either German rival, and the reaction from the European competition. That might be the most revealing chapter in the history of the luxury car market. When competitors purchased their own LS 400s and tore them down for analysis, they were stunned. BMW executives circulated rumors that Toyota must be selling the car below cost. Mercedes-Benz engineers were reportedly forced to make expensive last-minute changes to the upcoming W140S class in a frantic attempt to match the Lexus. The chief engineer of that Mercedes project lost his job when the redesign ran over budget. By 1990, Lexus LS 400 sales in the United States had surpassed the equivalent models from both Mercedes and BMW. In 1991, Lexus sold over 71,000 cars in America, uncomfortably close to Mercedes's total of 75,000, and much of that volume came from conquest sales, customers who had walked away from German dealerships and were never coming back. Car Magazine in Britain said the LS 400 beat the S-Class hands down. They judged it better than the Rolls-Royce Silver Spirit. The car that $1 billion and 6 years of Toyota's obsessive engineering culture had produced was not merely competitive with the finest European luxury sedans. It was, by many measures, superior, and it had been built by a company that 44 years earlier could not afford to put 2 headlights on a truck. The irony at the center of Japan's automotive triumph is difficult to overstate. The ideas that made Japanese cars great were American ideas, every single one of them. Statistical quality control, training within industry, assembly line innovation, and continuous improvement. These concepts were born in the United States, developed by American thinkers, proven in American factories during wartime. But when the war ended, America forgot them. Detroit was too busy selling cars to worry about building them better. The profits were too large, the market too captive, the competition too distant to justify the effort of listening to a statistician from Wyoming who kept talking about defect prevention and process design. It wasn't until 1980 that NBC aired a documentary called "If Japan Can, Why Can't We?" And suddenly the American public learned Deming's name for the first time. By then, Japanese cars had already captured a fifth of the American market. Ford finally hired Deming in 1981, and within 5 years the company produced the Ford Taurus, which became one of the best-selling American cars of its era. The lesson was always available. It just took losing to make anyone pay attention. What Japan did wasn't mysterious. It wasn't cultural magic or some inscrutable Eastern philosophy. Japan took ideas that were freely offered, refined them with discipline and patience, and applied them long after the country that created them had moved on to other things. The student studied the teacher's notes more carefully than the teacher ever did, and the cars on the road today, from the Corolla that starts every morning without complaint to the Lexus that whispers down the highway at 80, are the living proof of what happens when someone takes your best ideas seriously enough to actually use them.